for today's work, let's try to get all of these terms down first before you watch me do them. These are all terms you should be familiar with. There's a definition for each one. What I'd like you to do is to draw a diagram example for each of these types of angles. So take a minute to do that. Pause the video, do that first, and then we'll discuss. All right, so for vertical angles, what you want to have is exactly two lines that intersect each other. And once those two lines intersect each other, you can number the angles. So 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. And what you would say is that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3, and also that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. So if your diagram was similar to that, just go with it. If there was anything that is wrong about your diagram, if you got the wrong angle pairs, or if you didn't draw exactly two lines, fix that. And for all the rest of these, if it's close, if it's just a matter of labeling that's different, that's fine. But if you end up with something that's conceptually different, let's fix it. So adjacent means next to. So two angles that are next to each other, you could start with any one angle you want to and split it. And when you split it, it does not have to be an equal split. It can be whatever split you want. Call this angle 1 and angle 2. So that's an example of two adjacent angles. Any two angles that are next to each other sharing a ray are considered to be adjacent. All right, linear pair, two angles that are adjacent and supplementary. So now we do have to have a very specific kind of adjacency. So you start with a straight line, and then you can have a ray that goes any direction you want to. And we have angles 1 and 2 next to each other. Those are considered adjacent because they share a ray. They're also considered supplementary or a linear pair because they're on a straight line. So what I can now say is that measure of angle 1 plus measure of angle 2 is equal to 180. And we're just trying to summarize here with easy to see diagrams, so no real complicated equations here. Finally, at the bottom of the page, complementary angles would be any two that add up to 90. So you can do that within a single right angle. If you start with a right angle and then you split it whichever way you want to, whether you split it equally or not, doesn't matter. You have angle 1 and angle 2. Measure of angle 1 plus measure of angle 2 would equal 90. All right, and that's two complementary angles. Supplementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 180. So I'll give you two examples here. We could have a linear pair, something like this, with a 45 and a 135. Those add up to 180. We also could have two angles that are not connected at all. So an angle like this and an angle like this that have nothing to do with each other except that their measures add up to 180 as well. Okay, so you can either see it as a pair of detached angles or as a pair of attached angles that form a linear pair. So those are two different ways we can see supplementary angles. All right, on the next page, for each one of these, I'd like you to try it first, check all that apply, and then check, or you can unpause and check to see how you did with each of these. So try numbers 1 and 2 first on pause, and then we'll talk about them. All right, what you should see here is that the only one that applies is a vertical angle. These are vertical angles because it's two intersecting lines across each other. They're not adjacent to each other because they're not sharing a ray. They're not complementary or supplementary because we don't know anything about them adding up to 90 or 180. And to be a linear pair, they'd have to be next to each other along a straight line, like what I'm pointing to here, or over here, or even over here. All right, for number 2, we should have had adjacent checked, and we also should have had complementary checked. Because angles 1 and 2 are sharing a ray, that makes them adjacent. There's also a 90-degree angle on the one side, which makes the other side a 90-degree as well. And so these two angles would add up to 90 and therefore be complementary. They are not a linear pair because they don't go all the way over to the other side of the straight line. And that's also why they're not supplementary. Excuse me. For numbers 3 and 4, again, pause, take a second to try them, and then come back. All right, for number 3, these are adjacent, they are supplementary, and they are a linear pair. Adjacent because they share a ray, supplementary because they are along the same straight line and add up to 180, and the same thing, linear pair, because they're on the same straight line and forming a straight line when put together. So all three of those. For number 4, they are adjacent, and they are nothing else because I don't have any confirmation that that's a right angle, so I can't say they're complementary. Definitely not vertical because there aren't two lines crossing each other with angles opposite. There's not a straight line for either of the last two. All right, try numbers 5 and 6. Pause and come back. All right, so these two angles 1 and 2 are vertical, and they are also complementary. So let's discuss why that is. The reason they're vertical is because they are formed by exactly two lines. Even though there's a third line in the diagram, that third line does not have anything to do with these two angles. So those two lines that I just highlighted, that's how angles 1 and 2 are formed. And so that's why they're vertical. Complementary is true because if angle 2 were to come up to angle 1 and be equal to it, and I also have equal markings here, let me just erase those line highlights. You can see angle 1 is equal to the angle next to it. So this could also be considered angle 1. They're the same. So if angle 2 comes up here as a vertical angle, 1 plus 2 would equal the entire right angle. So that's a little bit trickier to see, but we needed to use these congruent angle markings to be able to get to that. And for number 6, they are vertical because they're across from each other. But if angle 2 comes up here, then it would be on the same, it would be supplementary to angle 1 as well because it would be another right angle. So they're both going to be right angles and they're both going to be vertical angles. However, they are not a linear pair. Just because they're supplementary does not make them a linear pair. Angles 1 and 2 are not next to each other, they're across from each other. So they are vertical, but they're not a linear pair and they're not adjacent. All right, so the last thing we're going to be doing is back on page 23. And so you can go back to page 23 and set up your equations. Just recall that for each of these, you have to decide if your equation is setting angles equal to each other or if it is setting them equal to a total. So be aware of that each time. Make sure you're solving the problem that is being asked.